top reason why open data is important, which is just a great way to set the scene. So perhaps we'll start with you and just have you, Kimberley, just start that off, and we can talk about that and hopefully bring the rest of the panellists in as they join.
So at Glasgow City Council, just to give you a really simple example of how we've been using open data, we were able to use open data from health on positive COVID cases in order to inform appropriate location for our mobile stations, and also to target communication with citizens about where to get tested, when to get tested, and also how to take. So that's really, really simple, but probably a current example is how we're using open data on busyness and footfall coming from pedestrian counters, object detection counters, and also just the location of key buildings like schools, retail, hospitality. And we're pulling all this together in order to identify and prioritise street cleansing routes. So we're using all this open data as a proxy for litter. So the more people, the more litter. And then we're using that to identify and prioritise the cleansing routes. So a couple of examples. In terms of why is open data important? Well, for me at the council, it's important because it builds openness, trust and transparency with our citizens and our communities, and that's really important. It's about building a shared understanding of the challenges and also the opportunities that we have, so that we can progress together. And it's about transparency of evidence-based decision making as well.
That ties in very much as the theme of the Scottish AI strategy, was trustworthy, ethical, inclusive. And when you're using your open data, you're building that transparency and building in the trust. So very important. So we'll move on and continue to talk about what the challenges are. So talking from your own perspective, what have the challenges been with getting involved with open data in terms of providing it or even using it yourself?
Certainly culturally is probably the biggest challenge. Everyone always thinks it's technology, but it's always a culture. And I think people, there's a natural tendency for people to be worried about sharing data. So they're worried about it might shine a light on something they're doing or not doing. They're also concerned about the quality, but more often they use quality as an excuse for shining a light on the current situation. So culture is difficult to overcome. From a process perspective, I think people underestimate what's involved in capturing, collecting the data, storing the data, and making it available in an easy, accessible platform. There's a lot of time and effort has to go into that, so process is really, really important. And technology, last but not least, certainly you have to have the right platform. You have to make sure that it is accessible. It's simple for people to use and understand. So yeah, a lot of challenges.
A lot of key points there, and fantastic, we've got our remote panellists now joining us, which is great to see. So what I'm going to do is, because we have to get started without you, I'm going to bring you in one at a time, if that's all right, and just ask you the first question. So the first question, if you remember, is tell us something that you've done with open data and one top reason why open data is important. So Nick, can I bring you in? So Professor Nick Bailey from University of Glasgow joining us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. So my work's based within the Urban Big Data Centre at the University of Glasgow, and we try to bring new forms of data to bear on our understanding of cities and their future development. And we are producers and consumers of open data. We work, I think Kimberley mentioned a little bit of our work producing measures of pedestrian footfall applying deep learning models to image data from the City Council's CCTV system. So the outputs from that work are open data. We use and consume a vast array of open data on demographics and population, on social characteristics, social indicators, pollution and physical environment, the economy and employment, and so on, in a wide range of projects. I think if you want to answer the question of what's the top reason for having open data, you ask, or I would ask, who benefits if you don't have open data? And I think there are two obvious beneficiaries. One is governments with poor policy making and poor decision making who evade scrutiny if you have to go through them in order to get the data, if they control the access to data. And the second group, arguably, I think, are large and well-established companies and corporations who have the deep pockets, for whom the cost of data is not a huge encumbrance, not a huge barrier. And it therefore keeps out of the market smaller companies and startups who don't have the same economies of scale. So open data is good for the scrutiny of public policy, good for community empowerment, and it's good for encouraging innovation and the kind of evolution of new players in different markets. So it's good for economic opportunity as well, I would say. That's me. I've shoehorned two reasons into one there, I think. So, thanks.
It's always hard to sort out and just choose one, isn't it? Thank you for that. And let me bring in Thomas Leitenen, who's Head of Data at the City of Helsinki, and ask you for your example of how you've used data in the past, and also let us know why open data is important in your opinion.
Okay, well, hello. To go a little bit back in the histories is that the Finnish cities, we produce a lot of different kinds of services, and we have digitalized them very, very long a time ago. So we continuously collect and produce large quantities of data. And for example, that we utilize it in the planning, production, decision-making processes, and so on. But it's traditionally the data has been in the cities like internal use, but since 2011, Helsinki metropolitan cities have been opening the data, and our data, open data portal is called Helsinki Region InfoShare, and it's over 11 years old. So it was the first in Finland and almost first in Europe. And the service aims to make the regional information quickly and easily accessible to everyone. So essentially, the portal is a web service for fast and easy access to open data and sources between the cities. And the data published includes, for example, statistics, geospatial data, and real-time APIs. And the data gives very comprehensive and diverse outlook on different urban phenomena such as living condition, economics and well-being, employment and transport and so on. But why we want to do it is that we feel that open data increases like citizens' knowledge and understanding of their living area, its history and future development. This increases overactivity, participation and interaction of citizens. And open data can be seen as a facilitator for creating new services, business opportunities, as well as supporting the research and development. So the value of public data increases the more it is used. So we feel that the data must be used by citizens, businesses, universities, academics, and so on. And the data on offer is ready to be used freely at no cost. So there are no limitations on users. Anyone interested in open data can be participate. But also the open data has increased the need for transparency, other matters related to digitalization. For example, the city of Helsinki has an AI registry for residents to see how we use AI in our city. And we want to also open our algorithms and source codes in the future as well, just like open data.
Thank you very much for that. It's a lot of important points that we've covered in there. As you joined the session, Kimberley was just telling us about some of the challenges that she's faced in terms of getting open data, and obviously people, process and technology can all be challenges in this area. Thomas, I'll come back to you and we'll go back around the other way and say, what sort of challenges have you experienced around people, process and technology when you're looking at open data and using open data?
Well, when we have open data for over 11 years, so we have solved very many kind of different reasons. For example, the big reason is that the value of open data may not be seen, and it can be very difficult. For example, organizations like cities, it's not easy to do things when the benefits are often indirect. So it will show in the resources. For example, currently there are only 2 persons working full-time supporting open data in the Helsinki region. So when we want to open the data for our ecosystem, that they can develop new services and innovation, the goal can be very, very far from the everyday life of the employee. So they may not see like the how open data can be so valuable. And other reason is also that data opening is often feared. It may be feared that there are errors in the data, and also the data open can be misused. And also there are data protection laws that are very daunting and for an individual employer. So employees, so when there are not processes that helping the employee, it can be very, very daunting. But I could say that in the last 10 years, the development, there has been a lot of development, and the fear of open data and errors in data has lowered very much. But at the same time, requirements for data and its quality has increased a lot.
Yeah, that's an excellent points there. Nick, would you have anything to add to that in terms of challenges of getting involved in open data?
I think I would agree with all the points that Kimberley and Thomas identified. I think I would certainly stress the problem about law in the UK context, that the GDPR has created a number of areas of uncertainty, which are sometimes genuine barriers and sometimes useful obstacles where, in Kimberley's point, the culture of people are resistant to or hesitant about releasing data. So things that we can do to clarify the law. And indeed some of the related legislation around copyright law as well. I think the other thing is, I think we're thinking a lot, Kimberley and Thomas are maybe thinking first about data which is already owned by the local authority or its partners. There's a lot of data in the private sector which has enormous value, and it has a commercial value to companies, so we can't necessarily expect the data to be instantly made freely available. But that raises issues either about resources to compensate for opening up data, or about, and I think more interestingly, about the opportunities that the political system has to require publication of data as part of its role in regulating certain activities. So you think about all the different things that go on in cities which are regulated in some way by public, by the law, require people to apply for licenses, be it as in the UK, private landlords, as bus operators, as mobile phone companies, and so on. In each of these cases, there's an opportunity for to introduce conditions within licenses that the provision of a certain level of open data will be a condition of operations. Now, there are costs perhaps to that, but but making an expectation at the start, you can potentially leverage a whole new raft of data, which will be enormously valuable for cities. So I think that's the main addition I think we could think about here to really change the game in terms of open data.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating points there, Nick. Thanks for that. I'm thinking particularly about how originally when mobile phone technology started to go in, every network had its own infrastructure. And if you were on one network, you might not have access to the nearest mobile phone mast. And that was only changed when legal systems came in to change it. And perhaps there's opportunity there to use the same sort of shared infrastructure on open data. Before we move on to the next question, I'm going to give you an opportunity, Kimberley, you've been sitting very quietly through this and listening well, to respond to any of the points that the remote panellists made and sort of bring the conversation back together. Is there anything you wanted to add in there?
Yeah, certainly what Thomas said about the value really resonated. because we need to get better at articulating the value of open data in order to ensure that there's appropriate investment in, you know, the process and the technology to support it. And also, as Nick said, in trying to open up that commercial data, which is hugely important to help cities do good rather than do evil. So yeah, I think both of those points really resonated. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Okay, so let's talk about getting better at this then. What do we as a society and as technical professionals sometimes have to do in order to move towards a society where we're better at open data? And I'm going to start with you in this question, Nick. So where do you see improvements being needed here?
It's a complex system with many parts to it. I think I might go back to the point that Thomas made about the fact that the benefits of open data for those responsible for creating it are often indirect, and the costs are often direct. And it's particularly when funding is so tight within local government, it's easy to see the cost and as a reason for closing things down. So I guess as a researcher and a user of open data, I think the one route to support government is providing feedback about where we've used data effectively and the changes that have come through it. And I think we do that in partnership with people like Kimberley working within a local authority who have a really kind of powerful role in trying to change the culture around data. I think between us we have to kind of demonstrate the value of opening up data. And the more of those stories that we can tell, the more I think it encourages and incentivizes authorities to open up the data. They can see the benefits become tangible as well as just seeing the costs.
Thanks for that. Kimberley, do you want to come in on that question? What do you think we need to do better?
Yeah, I would agree. We need to tell more stories about the success and also share where it has been successful, share that with colleagues. So it shouldn't be a secret how we've gone about it. Certainly, I work really closely with the other local authorities in Scotland. We're part of a sort of data task force where all 32 authorities are invited to come together and talk about data, but in particular open data is a subject that we're all really keen to share learning and to share case studies and examples to help promote it. So it doesn't matter the size and scale of the local authority, we're all delivering the same services and we're all trying to deliver better outcomes. So there's a lot to be said about sharing and good practice and in particular examples of where value's been delivered.
And on the flip side of being able to articulate the benefits, do you think there's a place where people are averse to the risks as well? That feels like part of it.
And it's actually, again, being able to talk to peers about risks and how people have overcome those risks or how people are mitigating those risks, again, is really helpful. We're all delivering the same services, but there are different challenges for rural and urban councils in particular about open data, especially linked to privacy and personally identifiable data. So yeah, just being able to discuss that in that kind of forum is really useful.
Brilliant. Thomas, I'm going to bring you in on that question as well. So for yourself, what do you see the key reasons we have to improve as a society? Where do we have to get better?
I think it's very important to recognize different kind of roles and also like development. First and foremost, the role of the city has always been data opener, but we want to be more and more part of the ecosystem and take advantage of the know-how of the ecosystem and use also open data more. So like when we are opening data in our Helsinki region, it's always supported by municipal cooperation and joint organizations, so we can publish the data set from the biggest cities all the time. So it's not just data from one city. So usually it's the region as a whole as well. And also we have very much focused on the communication about the data utilization and giving like examples, but also we want to try to boost the open data ecosystem by giving also the source codes, algorithms, and development tools to the ecosystem as well as the data. But we have learned that the quality of the data must be very, very high and always interoperable and interesting. For example, opening data close to people's everyday life, for example, public transport data or city bike data and so on.
Yeah, that's a really good point and an interesting point to bring in the idea of things that are supplementary to the data almost, the code and the AI algorithms and how far they can be open as well. So thank you very much for your comments on that, that was great. I'm noticing now that we've got some excellent questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to pick one or two of those to ask to the panel and see how we got on. I think the first one that's got a couple of likes on the list is about transparency. So to the panel generally, what do you think the limits of transparency are? Do you think that open data alone can promote data justice? And if not, what other interventions are necessary? So I'll let you volunteer to start that one off, I think. Are there limits to transparency?
I can start that. Yeah, I think the problem is that, like, we want to have like the problem is that the data is often indirect, and we have no always visible like to the who will use our data. We want to that the open data is used by anonymously and maybe part of different background processes, and so we cannot see usually how the data is used. So that's a big problem on the transparency. We want to be like transparent, but we can't see how the data is open, how the open data has been used.
And just to add to that, I think we can share our data that we have, but we've almost got a responsibility to point out what's missing. So where we've got data, that's great, but where we don't have data, people need to appreciate the context of what we're sharing. And I think that's really, really important. And quite often it can, you put a data set up there and people take it and make assumptions based on it and get yourself into all sorts of problems. So yeah, we've got a responsibility about doing more than just putting the data up there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Nick, I'm going to invite you if you've got anything you want to add.
Not that much. I mean, there are limits to transparency through privacy, quite rightly through privacy regulations. In terms of data justice, I'm not entirely sure what the phrase means, but I think for me, a number of angles are. Well, one angle is about quality of data and whether it represents the thing you think it does represent, whether it captures fairly and equally conditions in different parts of the city or for different social groups, for example. So you can make data open, but if it isn't measuring what you want to measure, you may get a distorted picture. So paying attention to the quality of data as well as opening data, I think is vital in that sense. And I think opening data and opening tools is fine, but it does still require a certain amount of skill and therefore a certain amount of resource to actually take advantage of them. So I don't think it's a complete answer to data justice in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. There's another question here which I think follows on quite nicely from here, which is essentially about cherry picking. And I wonder if this is intended from the questioner to mean intentionally cherry picking or just at the fact that we only have some data sets that are coming about. So by nature, we only ever have part of the picture and it might not be a representative part of the picture. So I'll tell you the question. It says, do you think cherry picking which data are made open as opposed to open by default is a problem?
It's certainly, in my experience, I wouldn't say we're cherry picking. We want to be open by default. I'm pretty sure at some point 10 years ago we said we were. It's definitely a journey. So we're from the data practitioner's point of view, we're not cherry picking. It's very much quality is really, really important. So it's about getting buy-in from data owners, data stewards, ensuring the quality, the process for capturing, collecting and storing the data. It's also about what's interesting for people. So we are engaging with citizens to find out, well, what data do they want to know what do they want to see, what do they want access to. I think Thomas mentioned in particular about people are interested in their communities and where they live, and so data that related to that is really, really important to them. So we're trying to prioritise that because it's almost an ask of us, rather than there's nothing sneaky about what we're putting up there. It can be driven by the citizen demand, but also can be what's available, what's in a really good condition, and therefore also about visualisation. So as well as making the data available, we're conscious that we have to do some visualisation. Just giving people raw data doesn't help anyone. So visualisation and storytelling as well, around about what's the visualisation telling you. So that's really, really key. And so I would say, certainly in my experience, we're not picking data to try and influence people. We want it all to be out there. It's just a timing thing and a prioritisation.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thomas, do you want to come in on that? Do you feel like if there's a patchwork of data available, that's a problem in there?
I think that we have done this almost over 10 years. So in the beginning, it was we opened very simple data. But I think the problem is at the moment that the requirements for the data are very, very high. I'm sure even if we can always offer such a high quality data, that's a problem. But we also want to have a discussion with the citizens and companies what kind of data you want, so they can always ask, and we usually it takes a long time because, for example, the city of Helsinki is the biggest organization in Finland. So it takes a lot of time to find the data that the citizens want, and sometimes it's something that we cannot open. But when we open the data, we have to be ready for criticism and dialogue. And that's a big thing in Finland as well, because we want to open also the data that have not been requested. So then there is sometimes a problem that people find something to criticism as well.
Thanks very much for that. Yeah, lots of great points there. Nick, have you anything to add on that cherry picking front?
Yeah, when you think about the enormous volumes of data which an authority would capture through its many, many different functions, schools, streets, social care, and so on, the idea that they could make all of it in somehow open by default, I don't know how realistic that is. It would be a huge resource, and I think the vast majority of it would be used by no one. So, we run a data service in the Open Big Data Centre, and we have a certain amount of funding from government. We have to prioritise how we use that in terms of staff, resources, and purchase of data sets. And we do it through working with user communities, the research communities, and our own sense of what the priorities are. And I think in a different kind of way, that's kind of what Thomas is describing as well. And I'm sure it's what Kimberley does. You have a sense of where the priorities are, and you'll go for those first. And it's not because I think there may be some other motivations for cultural resistance to opening up certain data sets, but in general, it reflects a constraint of resource on where you think the value is. So you can call it cherry picking or you can call it prioritizing, but I think some degree of that is inevitable given the sheer volume of data which an organization would hold.
I think you're absolutely right, and I would actually pick up on an extra point in there, which is the inevitability of Apache data, just because some things are inherently difficult to measure. Some parts of our activities generate a lot of data, so things that I do on my phone will generate a pathway, things that I do on the web will generate a pathway. If you've got a sensor, then that might measure something that I'm doing. But a lot of the time I'm not generating data with what I'm doing. You don't know how much time I spend hoovering and how much time I spend watching Netflix on the day-to-day. You can't tell that from data that's there. So just by the sheer limitedness of the amount of data we generate, even in the modern age when we generate more data than we've ever generated before, some things are always going to be easier to measure than others, and that can imbalance what we're seeing. And I think as a data scientist or an analyst, you always have to be aware of what you're not measuring as much as what you're measuring, which is part of this whole question, isn't it?
Sorry, Joanne, could I just come in on that point? I think it's a really good point. And as a researcher, we always worry about the danger of being data driven, the danger of starting from what data is available and simply answering the questions that you can answer with that data, when actually you should start with the questions that matter and bring data to it. Now, one of the things that's changed with the kind of digitalization of services and of social life and the creation of kind of digital footprints through our everyday activities is we focus much more on the data that's available. And we've been looking for ways to bring that data to apply it to a whole range of social challenges. And that's fantastic. And that's what the Urban Big Data Centre does. But we're really conscious that at times that will always leave gaps in important dimensions of the city that we don't capture by chance in these different systems. And we will always therefore need curated data which is, we call traditional surveys and traditional forms of qualitative data collection and so on to plug those gaps. So open data and indeed the whole variety of administrative and big data, these can only be part of the kind of way of seeing the city. If you want to get a kind of balanced and full picture of it.
Yeah, I think that was a really important response. Thanks for that. I'm going to stick with the audience questions just now because there's a lot coming in and there's some really good points in there. I think one of the key points here is that we've heard that we need to tell more stories about successful use of open data, but what are the key indicators of successful use which we should look out for? Should we look at the number of people using it, frequency of use, time value of the benefit? What kind of things would you use to indicate that success? Thomas, you've been doing this for a while now, so have you developed that sort of indicator in your systems?
Usually the company tries to sell like the program they have developed by our open data for us. So it's very fun, but I think it's something that we have to do a lot of work in the ecosystem. It's something we have to be involved in the ecosystem that we find. And sometimes also we have found like the problem is that they may not even tell that they have used the open data. So it's a business secret as well, because the data is open for everyone as well. So sometimes they keep it as a secret. And also we have to respect that as well. But we want to keep it very anonymous. We don't want to see like who are downloading. We are, even if it sounds very sad, but we are at the moment more interested about the downloads than the downloaders.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
But I think that's one of the principles of the open data is to keep it anonymous.
So there's a challenge here that you don't always know extensively who's using your open data, but if somebody was to come back to you with some sort of story or case study of how they had used your data, how would you go about assessing how well that was? What sort of indicators would you look for in terms of how successful a use of that data that had been? Just sort of flipping it a bit.
Well, the Helsinki region InfoShare every year we have a competition. So if you have used our data and have developed something from that, you can always tell us and take part of the competition. So when we are giving out small prizes, but they also get publicity about their programs and platforms and so on, what they had developed by our data, then we can also see what has been developed.
That's a great way of finding out what good practice is going out there.
Certainly for Glasgow, we're not probably as far down the journey as Helsinki, and therefore I'd be surprised if anybody was using our open data for that level of innovation, although definitely that's where we want to get to. But demonstrating value internally to the organisation is really important. So being able to articulate how we're using open data to help drive decisions and inform policy and operations at a very practical level, day to day, how open data is impacting on our service delivery is really, really important. And sadly, that really involves identifying a pound sign in terms of value. That's where we are in terms of the public sector. That's where it can sometimes be difficult. How do you put a price on that decision that you've made using that data? And that's the challenge we face. But I'm constantly asked for a pound sign in order to justify future investment. So yeah, if Thomas wants to give me a formula for that, then that would be great.
Nick, do you want to add anything to that discussion?
Just that it's a dilemma that we face as a data service and data producers ourselves. We'd love to know, and we would love to be able to demonstrate to our funder more about the kind of usage of our data, but you want to put as few barriers between the users and the data as possible. We do, our data is for research purposes primarily, so we do try to monitor its use within research, and you look for citations of the data and citations of the research coming out for it. And we work with policymakers to try to kind of understand where they use our research, so we can tell the stories to the funders about the wider public benefit of what we do. But we don't have a simple answer, I'm afraid.
That's a really interesting point, because citations are a big thing, but they're only really used in the academic sector. Do you think we should be looking to push that into other sectors to sort of tie together the story and the impact and allow people to report back on what they're doing with these open data sets?
Why not? I mean, the use in scientific publications may not be a lot of direct value for many local authorities. The two things are not always highly correlated, but it does give another way of seeing how users are using your data, and it's a way of getting feedback on the quality of your data and the problems people are potentially finding within it as well, or conversely on the kind of strength and value of it, where they've conducted validation exercises to kind of compare it with other sources. So I think certainly, and given funder requirements on open publication, there are fewer barriers to viewing academic outputs where it's funded research, at least. So yes, maybe it's another way for local authorities and others to see the value of open data.
Is that something you would consider, Kimberley?
Absolutely, yeah. I would welcome anybody telling me that the data's been valuable. Keep me in a job for another year, so yeah.
Would you do that yourself, though, if you were using the data internally? Would you publish it and cite it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big campaigns that internally we've got at the moment, is that awareness of how we're using the data and demonstrating the value, so that people might appreciate the synergy with how we've done something in this area of the council, and therefore they can do something similar with other open data. So yeah, it's a huge push for us.
Thomas, do you use these sorts of academic levers in your work, sort of publications and citations, or would you?
No, we do. But I think that this is also very much about the transparency and how you can put a value on transparency. For example, we feel that that's the most important thing in our open data, is the transparency for governance. It's always improved, and the governance activities can be viewed and just on the basis on the facts. And also we have to remember that the data doesn't vary in use. So it's always collected in the city of Helsinki by tax money. So it should be used by everyone. So we have already collected data, and the costs are done. So the value for transparency is very important, as we don't see any euros.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about funding as well. It's the importance of understanding what the money's being used for. And I'm actually looking at quite a lot of really good questions here, and I'm trying to sort of pull out what the themes are, because we'll not get to ask them all. There's an interesting theme about technology here. So there's one about whether blockchain might be useful. There's a one about how do you ensure the data is published in a format and scale that's useful? Those certainly, Thomas and Kimberley, you must have taken a decision and a view already about how you use technology to make your data open. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that, and we'll try and cover some of these questions together. So Kimberley, I'll bring you in first.
Yeah, certainly what's been really important to us, not just about making the data open, but it's making it accessible. So we're really keen to engage with user groups and citizens and communities to try and inform how they're going to be accessing and using the data. More importantly, when they come to our platform, how are they going to navigate to what's important to them? So multiple different persona types who are interested in open data. So you've got individual citizens, you've maybe got visitors coming to the city, you've got academics, absolutely, you've got investors and developers. There's so many. There's so much data, so when they come to our platform, it's really important that they very quickly get to the data that they're looking for and that it's useful. So we're spending a lot of time and effort in ensuring that user interface is going to do exactly what it needs to do, and if there's minimal number of clicks gets people to what they need. So we've had a lot of feedback from external companies and consultancies and as I say, citizens themselves, and we're now on a journey to sort of improve that. So the platform in itself is we had something lying around in a cupboard, so that was fine. I didn't have to buy anything. And actually it's, you can be technology agnostic in terms of what platform you use, but it's about how you use it. And for us, it's the interaction, that interactive element that's been really, really important to us. So yeah, I'd say that user experience is really key part of the technology. There's also the responsibility of the technology to ensure that your open data is maintained and refreshed. Because if people find something they like, then they might start using it and they're going to come back. And so you can't put a data set up there once and let it languish for 3 years. We've got a responsibility to refresh it, to make sure everybody understands how often it's refreshed, etc. So I think that's, again, it's another cost, but I think it's really, really important. MD can throw up a platform and put some data sets on there, but it's about the sustainability, and that'll be what keeps people coming back.
That's a really good, quite a lot of good points there. So yeah, that's really useful. Nicola, pull you in to have a slightly different take on this. How do you solve these technology problems? How do you tackle these challenges at the UBDC?
I think Kimberley's point about the users is a good one, but I think one of the things that has shifted in the last 5 years in terms of access to public data is the increasing availability of machine-readable data. There's been a long history of paper-based publications which translated into kind of spreadsheets for human reading formats and less technical users, but the availability of APIs where you can download bulk data formatted for AI and other applications, that's the thing which I think really is changing the game for more complex analysis. As a local authority, I'm sure Kimberley and Thomas have to think about the wider range of users, but in terms of the kind of theme of this conference, I think it's that machine readable formats which are so vital. And I think the other point which I think Thomas made earlier on is about interoperability of data. I work a lot on housing and property-based data. We are just creeping towards having more of the open or at least freely available property-related data coming with the unique property reference number, the UPRN, attached to it by default. But it's been a slow process. Without that, we're struggling with all the kind of crappy formatting of addresses and the variations in the way in which people type addresses in different places. Huge amount of extra value added if you have systematic keys embedded into the data. And that really means capturing those keys as part of the data capture process. If you allow people to put in badly formatted addresses and then try to attach the UPRN afterwards, you lose an awful lot in the process. So designing systems with the end use of open, shareable, linkable data in mind, I think changes the way, just makes you think about those basic data linkage and description questions at the start, to the point where you capture the input of data. I'm sure it has parallels in many other spheres as well. So those are my two issues, I think.
Yeah, that's really good points in there. Thomas, I'm going to bring you in there, and I'm going to ask you a specific question around technology, because you've been doing this for a while and technology changes quite quickly. So I think I'm quite interested in how you in Helsinki are keeping up with these changes in technology when you're offering these services with open data.
Yeah, it shows very much like what kind of requests for the data comes. So now we have almost 200 APIs open, and data sets we have over 600. So the APIs are are coming more and more, but we also want to that everyone can use the open data, not just people who understand what kind of file JSON is, but also that everyone can use. So we do a lot of data analysis based on the open data, so we can build like platforms based on maps and so on, so everyone can use. But I think the big like the ownership of the data is very important. Like the who owns the data is very important. That he or she must choose like also the technology. So it's a big change from the data owner to owner of the open data. So when the data is open, you need to commit to opening and updating the data in the future. For example, companies and other users need to be able to trust that they will get the data in the future as well. And then the technology can also develop. So it can start from simple Excel file, and soon when it's used, it can be found from API.
Thanks very much for that. Some excellent points there. I think I'd like to return to our scripted questions now, because there's one question I'm quite keen for us to tackle, and that's the question on ethics. So when it comes to open data, what ethical considerations do you have to go through when you're making a data set open, when you're using open data? From your perspective as people that are involved in this generally, where are the pitfalls, where are the spaces where you can go wrong? I'll come to you first, Nick, for that one.
So I think the ethical issues, for me, there are two aspects to this. One is the obvious privacy angle. You need to do all the usual disclosure checking and have useful rules to minimize risks of disclosure of any personal information. But the other ethical concern for me is the point I made earlier about how well the data represent the thing you think they're trying to represent. So if you're, and the great example here is, the kind of the data that you get from Fix My Street, one of these online reporting apps where you can say there's a problem with my road. And we see biases in these data where it tends to be the more middle class area where there was higher uptake of mobile phones earlier on, but also I guess more time to worry about the potholes rather than other challenges of getting by on a day-to-day basis. You get an overrepresentation of demand in those kind of areas and an underrepresentation elsewhere. So I think too often with data we focus on the on the privacy concerns and not enough on the bias and distortion concerns. So we have to know that our data give a fair representation. Otherwise, we risk building distorted policies on the back of distorting data.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Two key aspects of ethical considerations there. Thomas, is there anything you want to add on to that? Any particular ethical considerations that you consider in your role?
Yeah, I think the free access to open data is very important. It lowers the threshold for utilizing data. The free data is a very equality factor in today's, when the data may be very, very valuable. So that's very important. And also, like, it's sometimes we have collect data for good, but when we are open, it can be misused. For example, like statistic about immigration. So it's sometimes ethical not to open the data because it will be misused.
I think that was a really interesting framing. I love the fact that it can be unethical to not disclose the data as well as having risks of disclosing it. I like that. Kimberley?
Yeah, I think just very much agree with what both Nick and Thomas have said there. We have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, to make people appreciate the context in which we're publishing the data, and that can be quite difficult to do just on a basic platform, because you're saying, here's this data, and actually you need to have like a postscript, here's what's missing. And yes, ethically, it can be, the right thing can be to not post data, and it can be very, very simple data sets that people don't appreciate, but quite often we found that opening data suddenly can be used politically against you. You find yourself on the front page of the newspaper, you're trying to do the right thing, and yeah, people again take it out of context. So yes, it can be a fine line.
That reputational damage, always a difficult one. Yeah, I think that's really important. So we're just coming to the last sort of 5 minutes of the session. I think because this is the Scottish AI Summit, I think that's the question that we should probably tackle with the last bits of the panel. So let's take all the things that we've been thinking about on open data. When that open data is then used in AI, whether internally, whether externally, what are the complexities that come into this discussion from that further use case of the data? And is there any additional considerations that you have to build into your open data when people are putting it to that more advanced AI type route? Kimberley, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think just again building on the last question, it's about the more open data, obviously, the better in terms of supporting the training and development of AI. But there's always going to be data missing, so it's about understanding the bias and the representational value of what you do have. That's absolutely key. But equally, the more we can all open up our data, the more that's there, and the less, hopefully the less gaps there'll be. But yeah, it's just about the people in charge of developing the AI have to have an appreciation of what's missing in the data that they're using.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, yeah. Nick, do you have any particular processes that you put in place if you've got an AI use case in mind, or is there anything you would do differently?
Not particularly differently from using open data than from using any other kind of data. I think, as Kimberley says, you want to be sure about the robustness of the models and the predictions that flow from them. And make sure you're not, putting in distorting data and producing distorting pictures. That would be the main concern, I think, which is common regardless of whether we're talking about open data or other forms of data as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thomas, is there anything particular that you would consider when there's AI being used here?
I think it's very important that the people understand the data and the metadata and so on, and also that we understand that when we are opening data for AI, it's usually very big data sets and a lot of data. So we have to be very sure that the data cannot be linked with other data sets that will identify persons. So that's very big risk with the AI.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think what we've discussed has touched on a few different points, but I think the importance of not just focusing on what data is there, but and understanding what data is absent has come through clearly in all of the discussions. Understanding the limitations of being able to make data open for reasons of privacy, but also for reasons of practicality and for what's easy to measure and what's not has all come through in that. I think with artificial intelligence, and when you bring these applications through, you can't forget the value of the basic analytics step that help you to really understand what the model is telling you. And it does have extra requirements in terms of the technology and that you need to be able to use, and the ability for the analyst and the data scientist to really understand the context of the models they're developing. So with that, I'm going to bring the panel to a close. Thank you very much to our three panellists, Kimberley Hose from Glasgow University, Kimberley Hose from City of Glasgow Council, apologies, Nick Bailey from, my apologies, Nick Bailey from University of Glasgow Urban Big Data Centre, and Thomas Leitenen from the City of Helsinki. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to Joanna for great sharing. And apologies to anyone who's had audio issues. I believe they've all been sorted now. So the joys of hybrid. But thank you very much, everyone. And now you'll be glad to hear it's lunchtime. So please head on upstairs. Food's everywhere, but please do also check out all the amazing robots at the National Robotarium stand. There's a really, really cute rabbit one. It purrs when you touch it. And also the new Reel, who will be giving a demonstration of their platform, their AI arts platform as well. So enjoy lunch. See you all back in your relevant sessions at 1:30. Thank you.